Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that Trump's most desperate threat to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods was not a show of American strength, but the final admission that America had completely lost control of its northern neighbor? And what if I told you that this threat, designed to stop Canada from becoming China's backdoor into North America, actually accelerated Canada's transformation into an independent economic superpower that no longer needs American permission to prosper? Most people believe this is a story about trade wars and tariff battles. They see Trump as 100% tariff threat, as aggressive negotiating tactics designed to force Canadian compliance with American demands. They assume this represents American strength being deployed against a subordinate ally who stepped out of line. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete collapse of American leverage over Canada, revealed through threats so desperate that they accelerated the very outcomes they were designed to prevent. This is not trade policy. This is the death throes of economic empire, executing itself through the very weapons it believed would preserve its dominance. The panic began in January 2026 when Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada would allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into Canadian markets annually at a preferential tariff rate of just 6.1%. To most observers, this appeared to be a simple trade agreement between Canada and China. But American intelligence analysts understood immediately what this represented: the systematic dismantling of American economic control over the North American market through a Chinese partnership that bypassed all American oversight and influence. Trump's reaction was immediate and revealed the depth of American strategic desperation. Within hours of the announcement, he posted on social media that Canada was becoming China's backdoor into America, and threatened to impose 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods if the China deal was not canceled immediately. This was not calculated diplomacy. This was panic expressed through economic threats that demonstrated how completely American influence over Canadian policy decisions had evaporated. But Trump's analysis was fundamentally wrong, and his response made the situation catastrophically worse for American interests. Canada was not becoming China's backdoor into America. Canada was becoming an independent economic power that could choose its own partners based on Canadian interests rather than American preferences. The Chinese electric vehicle agreement was not designed to help China penetrate American markets. It was designed to help Canada develop its own automotive industry while reducing dependence on American economic approval. The mathematical reality of the Canadian-Chinese agreement reveals the sophistication of Canadian strategic thinking and the primitive nature of American response. The 49,000 vehicle quota was conditional on Chinese companies establishing manufacturing facilities in Canada within 3 years. This meant that Chinese vehicles sold in Canadian markets would increasingly be manufactured by Canadian workers using Canadian resources, creating Canadian jobs and Canadian technological capabilities. More importantly, the agreement included provisions requiring that within 5 years, more than half of the Chinese vehicles sold in Canada must be manufactured in Canada. This was not Canada opening its markets to Chinese imports. This was Canada using Chinese capital and technology to build Canadian industrial capacity that would eventually compete with both Chinese and American manufacturers. American policymakers completely missed this strategic dimension because they remained trapped in colonial thinking that assumed Canadian economic activity was automatically relevant to American markets and American security. They could not comprehend that Canada was pursuing an independent economic strategy designed to benefit Canadian interests, regardless of American approval or disapproval. The 100% tariff threat revealed how thoroughly American strategic thinking had deteriorated under pressure from Canadian independence. Trump and his advisors apparently believed that threatening to make Canadian goods unaffordable in American markets would force Canada to abandon relationships with China and return to subordinate status within an American-dominated North American economic system. This logic failed because it was based on the false assumption that Canada needed American market access more than America needed Canadian resources. The reality, which became apparent immediately after Trump's tariff threat, was precisely the opposite. American refineries depend on Canadian heavy crude oil that cannot be easily replaced by domestic light crude production. American agriculture depends on Canadian potash fertilizer that controls soil fertility throughout the Midwest. American manufacturing depends on Canadian aluminum, steel, and other materials that flow across the border in integrated production systems. When Trump threatened 100% tariffs, he was essentially threatening to destroy American industrial competitiveness, while providing Canadian companies with powerful incentives to redirect their products toward markets that would pay premium prices without political complications. Chinese companies, European buyers, and other international customers were eager to purchase Canadian resources and products that American tariffs would make unavailable in American markets. The immediate market reaction revealed how completely the dependency relationship had reversed from American advantage to Canadian leverage. Canadian commodity prices increased within hours of Trump's threat, as international buyers moved to secure supplies that might be redirected away from American markets. Canadian oil futures jumped 12% as refineries in Asia and Europe competed for crude supplies that American refineries might be forced to abandon due to tariff costs. Canadian agricultural products experienced even more dramatic price increases as Chinese buyers, already engaged in expanding trade relationships with Canada, offered premium prices for wheat, canola, and other products that American importers might be unable to purchase due to tariff barriers. Canadian farmers, who had been concerned about American political threats to their traditional markets, suddenly found themselves with alternative customers willing to pay higher prices than American buyers had ever offered. The psychological impact on Canadian businesses and policymakers was transformative. For decades, Canadian companies had structured their operations around the assumption that American market access was essential for profitability and growth. Trump's 100% tariff threat demonstrated that American market access had become a vulnerability rather than an advantage, because it made Canadian companies subject to American political decisions that could destroy their business models overnight. Canadian companies responded by accelerating diversification strategies that reduced their dependence on American customers and American supply chains. Export companies that had sold 70 to 80% of their products to American buyers began aggressive marketing campaigns in European and Asian markets that offered more stable long-term relationships. Manufacturing companies that had integrated their production systems with American facilities began establishing standalone Canadian operations that could serve global markets without American intermediation. The most sophisticated Canadian companies recognized that Trump's tariff threat represented a strategic opportunity to restructure their business models around genuine independence from American economic control. Instead of viewing 100% tariffs as a catastrophic threat to their survival, they positioned themselves to capture the premium prices and market opportunities that would result from American buyers being unable to access Canadian products. The irony was profound. Trump's threat to punish Canada for developing relationships with China actually incentivized Canadian companies to deepen their relationships with China and other non-American partners who could provide market access without political complications. Chinese buyers, recognizing that American tariffs might restrict Canadian access to American markets, offered long-term contracts at guaranteed prices that were substantially higher than prevailing American market rates. The European response was equally supportive of Canadian independence from American economic control. European companies that had been competing with American buyers for Canadian resources suddenly found themselves with preferential access as American tariffs made American purchases economically unviable. European automotive companies, aerospace manufacturers, and technology firms began establishing partnerships with Canadian companies that had previously been primarily focused on American markets. The Canadian government's response to Trump's tariff threat revealed the strategic sophistication that American policymakers had consistently underestimated. Instead of panicking or offering concessions to avoid American tariffs, Prime Minister Carney announced that Canada welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate its economic independence from American political control. He stated publicly that 100% American tariffs would simply accelerate Canadian efforts to develop alternative markets that offered more predictable and profitable relationships than American buyers had provided. More importantly, Carney announced that Canada would respond to American tariffs with reciprocal measures that would affect American access to Canadian resources and Canadian markets. Given the integrated nature of North American supply chains and American dependence on Canadian inputs, reciprocal Canadian tariffs would impose costs on American companies and American consumers that were substantially higher than the costs imposed on Canadian companies by American tariffs. The mathematical analysis supported Carney's confidence. American imports from Canada totaled approximately $430 billion annually, while Canadian imports from America totaled approximately $380 billion annually. This meant that tariff wars would impose higher absolute costs on American companies and American consumers than on Canadian companies and Canadian consumers. More importantly, Canadian resources were essential inputs for American industrial production, while American exports to Canada were largely finished goods that could be sourced from alternative suppliers. Canadian tariffs on American agricultural products would force American farmers to compete for alternative export markets that were already oversupplied and highly competitive. Canadian tariffs on American manufactured goods would simply redirect Canadian purchases toward European and Asian suppliers who were eager to expand their market share in Canadian markets. Canadian tariffs on American energy products would accelerate Canadian development of domestic renewable energy resources that would reduce Canadian dependence on American energy imports permanently. The strategic implications became apparent when other countries recognized that American threats against Canadian economic independence created opportunities for expanding their own relationships with Canadian companies and Canadian markets. Countries throughout Europe, Asia, And Latin America, that had been constrained by American political pressure from developing closer economic relationships with Canada, suddenly found themselves courted by Canadian officials, seeking to diversify trade relationships and reduce dependence on American markets. The most significant development was accelerated Chinese investment in Canadian infrastructure, manufacturing, and resource development projects that would support expanded Chinese-Canadian trade relationships regardless of American political objections. Chinese companies that had been hesitant to invest in Canadian projects due to American political pressure suddenly found themselves welcomed by Canadian officials who recognized that Chinese capital and Chinese markets provided alternatives to American dependence. Chinese investment in Canadian Arctic shipping infrastructure, Canadian mining operations, and Canadian agricultural processing facilities accelerated dramatically after Trump's tariff threat, as both countries recognized mutual benefits from economic cooperation that bypassed American oversight and American political complications. Chinese companies gained access to Canadian resources and Canadian expertise, while Canadian companies gained access to Chinese capital and Chinese markets that were substantially larger and more profitable than American alternatives. The technological dimension of expanding Chinese-Canadian cooperation represented the most serious long-term threat to American economic interests. Chinese companies offered Canadian businesses access to manufacturing technologies, research and development capabilities, and supply chain networks that American companies had traditionally controlled or influenced. Canadian companies that accepted Chinese partnerships gained technological capabilities and market access that made them more competitive, not only in Chinese markets, but in global markets where they would compete directly with American companies. The acceleration of Canadian-Chinese technological cooperation was particularly threatening to American companies in sectors like renewable energy, electric vehicles, advanced manufacturing, and telecommunications, where Chinese companies possessed technological advantages and market access that American companies could not match. Canadian companies that partnered with Chinese businesses gained access to these advantages, while maintaining their traditional strengths in resource extraction, engineering expertise, and democratic governance structures that Chinese companies valued but could not replicate independently. The ultimate strategic failure of Trump as 100% tariff threat was its complete misunderstanding of the leverage relationships that determined Canadian policy decisions. American policymakers assumed that threatening Canadian access to American markets would force Canadian submission to American demands because they believed Canadian economic prosperity depended on American market access. The reality was that Canadian economic prosperity increasingly depended on diversifying away from American market dependence toward relationships with partners who offered more stable and profitable long-term cooperation. Trump's threat actually accelerated this diversification by providing Canadian companies and Canadian policymakers with compelling evidence that American market access was a strategic vulnerability rather than a strategic advantage. Companies that had been reluctant to invest in alternative market development suddenly found themselves with no choice but to reduce their dependence on American customers who could be removed from their business models overnight due to American political decisions. The broader implications of American strategic failure extended beyond bilateral relationships to encompass fundamental questions about American ability to maintain influence over allies and partners in an increasingly multipolar global economy. Other American allies observed Canadian success in resisting American economic pressure and recognized that American threats had become less credible and American alternatives had become less essential for their own economic prosperity and political independence. Countries throughout the world that had structured their economic policies around maintaining American approval and American market access began reconsidering whether American partnership provided sufficient benefits to justify the political constraints and economic limitations that American demands imposed on their sovereign decision-making processes. The Canadian example demonstrated that middle powers could successfully resist American pressure while building alternative relationships that provided superior economic outcomes and greater political independence. The transformation of Canadian-American relationships from American dominance to Canadian independence represented one of the most significant shifts in North American geopolitics since Canadian Confederation. For the first time in over a century, Canada possessed genuine alternatives to American partnership that provided comparable or superior economic benefits without requiring subordination to American political demands or American policy preferences. Canadian success in building these alternatives while resisting American economic pressure demonstrated that American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere was no longer automatic or inevitable. Countries that chose to maintain close relationships with the United States would do so because American partnership provided genuine mutual benefits, rather than because they lacked alternatives to American dominance. The mathematical precision of Canadian strategic success was evident in the economic data that emerged during the months following Trump's tariff threat. Canadian trade with China increased by 23% as Chinese companies moved to secure preferential access to Canadian resources and Canadian markets. Canadian trade with the European Union increased by 19% as European companies recognized opportunities created by potential American withdrawal from Canadian markets. Canadian trade with other non-American partners increased across all sectors as Canadian companies successfully demonstrated that their products and services provided value to international customers, regardless of American political approval. Meanwhile, American companies that depended on Canadian inputs faced immediate cost increases and supply disruptions that affected their competitiveness in both domestic and international markets. American refineries that processed Canadian heavy crude oil faced margin pressures that forced them to reduce production and lay off workers. American manufacturers that used Canadian aluminum and steel faced input cost increases that made their products less competitive against international competitors who maintained access to Canadian materials at market prices. The human cost of American strategic failure became apparent in American communities that depended on economic relationships with Canadian companies and Canadian markets. Border communities that had prospered from cross-border trade experienced immediate economic decline as tariff threats disrupted business relationships that had sustained employment and community prosperity for decades. American agricultural regions that exported products to Canadian markets faced reduced demand and lower prices as Canadian buyers redirected their purchases toward alternative suppliers. Most significantly, American consumers faced higher prices and reduced choices as tariffs eliminated their access to Canadian products that had provided affordable alternatives to more expensive domestic production. Energy costs increased as tariffs affected Canadian oil and electricity imports. Food costs increased as tariffs affected Canadian agricultural products. Housing costs increased as tariffs affected Canadian lumber and other construction materials. The political consequences of these economic costs became apparent as American voters in affected regions began opposing politicians who supported tariff policies that imposed costs on American families while providing no visible benefits to American economic interests. Congressional representatives from border states, agricultural regions, and energy-dependent areas found themselves caught between supporting administration policies and representing constituents who were being harmed by those policies. The electoral implications were particularly significant in swing states where small margins could determine presidential election outcomes. States like Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Ohio that depended heavily on economic relationships with Canada experienced immediate economic costs from tariff threats while receiving no compensating benefits from alternative economic policies. Political analysts recognized that tariff policies that imposed costs on these states without providing visible benefits could affect electoral outcomes in future presidential elections. Canadian policymakers recognized these American political vulnerabilities and structured their responses to maximize pressure on American political constituencies that had influence over American policy decisions. Canadian retaliatory measures were designed to affect American agricultural exports, American energy companies, and American manufacturing operations in states and districts where political leaders had the most influence over American trade policy and foreign policy decisions. The precision of Canadian political targeting demonstrated strategic sophistication that American policymakers had consistently underestimated. Instead of imposing broad retaliatory measures that would affect all Americans equally, Canadian policies focused pressure on specific American economic interests and specific American political constituencies that had the ability to influence American policy decisions through electoral pressure and lobbying influence. The effectiveness of this strategy became apparent when American business organizations, agricultural associations, and energy companies began lobbying American political leaders to reverse tariff policies that were harming their economic interests while providing no visible benefits to American competitiveness or American security. These lobbying efforts created political pressure that competed directly with administration arguments for maintaining aggressive trade policies toward Canadian independence. By the end of 2026, it had become apparent that Trump's 100% tariff threat had achieved the opposite of its intended objectives. Instead of forcing Canadian submission to American demands, the threat had accelerated Canadian independence from American economic control. Instead of preventing Canadian partnerships with China, the threat had provided Canadian and Chinese companies with compelling incentives to deepen their cooperation and expand their mutual investments. Instead of strengthening American economic influence over North American markets, the threat had demonstrated American inability to control Canadian policy decisions through economic pressure. The strategic failure represented more than a diplomatic setback. It represented the end of American assumptions about automatic dominance over Canadian economic decisions and Canadian foreign policy choices. Canada had successfully called America's bluff and demonstrated that American economic threats were no longer sufficient to override Canadian strategic interests and Canadian political independence. Most people still do not understand what occurred during this critical period. They continue to view Canadian-American relationships through outdated frameworks that assume American dominance and Canadian dependence. But the economic data, the trade flows, And the political dynamics reveal a transformed relationship where Canada increasingly sets the terms of cooperation based on Canadian interests rather than American demands. Trump's 100% tariff panic revealed the death of American economic empire in North America. The threats designed to preserve American control actually destroyed it by forcing Canada to prove it no longer needed American permission to prosper. This is how economic empires end. Not through dramatic military defeats, but through desperate threats that reveal their complete lack of leverage over those they assumed they controlled.